Milam and I have a very special agenda today. We want to focus on the topic of simplifying communication and building influence in our organizations. We're going to talk about three things. The first is, what is influence? What is goodwill? What are the definitions of those things? We're going to talk about what can that mean for introverts versus extroverts differently? And lastly, what are some practical tips you can take away to apply today, tomorrow in your workplace so that you can simplify communication and build influence within your organization? I'm Chris, founder and CEO of The Hidden Speaker, a training consultancy that focuses on effective technical and data presentation. For us scientists, researchers, analysts, we have so much complex work. Why not make sure that it's compelling and impactful for the people that care about it the most? That's what I focus on. Milam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. And welcome, everyone. I see California, sunny West Coast, all the way to Germany. So we are so glad you are joining us today. My name is Milam Miller. I am the founder of Be Confident and Kind, which is a leadership development practice aimed at helping rising leaders increase their influence and, of course, build goodwill in organizations and communities they serve. We offer a number of keynotes and workshops, as well as coaching services to leaders who need it most. The change only takes one person. It all starts with each one of us. So Chris and I are excited today to talk about communication, a fundamental aspect of increasing influence and building goodwill in organizations.
So excited for this. Milam, I think I'll punt it to you for the very first topic, which is, what is influence? How would you define it?
Sure. So in my own words, Chris, this is a really interesting word, because this day and age, I think of influencers, right, on social media. And I think that this topic has become misconstrued. So for me, all influence simply means is the ability to inspire or motivate others. If you carry with you influence, then you're able to connect with others. And through inspiring them or motivating them, you are able to move things forward in an organization, which we know is so critical.
I love that. And it's something that I also resonate with a lot, because my audience is typically technical, data, scientific folks. What I see too often is people focusing on giving information. That's not the key to building influence. The key to building influence is inspiration, as you said. And I think the real difference there is how we think about communicating information. We think if we give people more and more and more, they'll be more informed. But it's actually quite the opposite. If you overwhelm people with numbers and data and stuff on a slide, they're going to tune out.
Sure.
But the key to building influence is really thinking about, what experience am I giving people of this information? How can I let them see the so what and inspire them to do something with all the information I've given them?
I love that. I'm almost hearing you say, Chris, like a less is more.
Yes.
By giving less, there's more impact. Mm-hmm. So the inspiration doesn't come from more technical details and overwhelming people. The more comes from actually the less, bottom lining it and inspiring people to act or drive change or move things forward.
Absolutely. I'd add that another component that I see often lost for especially technical presentations is, who are the people that I'm speaking to? Often we'll just sit in the room with our laptop creating the slides, but really we have to think, who is it that we're speaking to? What do they need? What information can I include to address those needs? Some people, for example, really need the tech and the data stuff to believe in the material. Some people don't want that at all, and they want the emotion, the storytelling, the big picture. And some people really want the authority and credibility behind what you say. Who is backing you up? Who in the organization do I trust that supports your recommendation? So the key to influence is really understanding, how can we account for all those different audiences?
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing you say is audience first approach. Who is my audience? That's a question that we can all ask ourselves. In addition to that, oftentimes kind of bringing it back to an influencer lens through social media, when we think of traditional influencers, it's one way, like, check out this glass water bottle, like, you should buy it because. But what I'm hearing you say is actually, when we think about our audience, it's really a two-way interaction. And that's where this communication piece comes in. This glass water bottle has created whatever benefits for me. Maybe I realized that plastic was creating hair loss and that's something I'm trying to fix. So it's engaging your community or your audience. Has anybody else experienced hair loss? Perhaps it's your water bottle. That's what just a tangible example we can think about whenever we're engaging an audience and thinking about that audience first approach. What matters to them? Who is my audience and why?
I did not know that about plastic, so thank you for telling me about that.
I used to have a Gatorade plastic water bottle. That's so I've upgraded, Chris. That's what.
Yeah,
for.
Fantastic. I'd love to add to that because something that I think a lot of us confuse for communication is just two monologues happening at the same time. I see some person A says, I believe this, and person B says, no, I believe this. And then you just keep going farther and farther away as you talk at each other. But conversation is two-way, as you said. It's person A saying, this is what I believe. And maybe person B can say, tell me more about that. Let me understand your point of view. And from there, you can go in the same direction together.
Totally. I think that's a good segue to Goodwill. But before we go there, I want to encourage any listeners, based on the perspective that Chris shared and I shared, what is your perspective on influence? What does that look like for you and in your workplace? We'd love to see comments. We'd love to see additional perspectives on how you view the word influence in the age of influencers. While you do that, Chris, you talked about talking at each other, right? Yeah. Butting heads almost. What does Goodwill mean to you?
Goodwill for me it's a difficult subject because I was talking to one client recently who said to me, they don't think their genuineness and authenticity are important in the workplace. And I said, tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. They said their only model for leadership that they've seen in these big tech companies they work in is the stereotypical authoritative leader who gives the tasks and expects them to be done. There's no goodwill, let's say, there. Mm-hmm. And I said, that is such a shame to see, that the only model of effective leadership that you believe in is one where it's just you get it done, you say over time, you get more work done that they command. Goodwill for me is when everyone can feel empowered to do great work in the workplace. And the leader is not just one who gives tasks clearly and concisely, which is, of course, an important part of the role, but someone who also cultivates relationships with people. You need to have both. You need to have the confidence and the clarity to tell people what to do as a leader, but you also need to let people feel cared for, supported, so that they can figure out how to do their best work on their own.
Mm. I love that you use that word confidence in others, because it's so central to my practice.
That's right.
Brilliant share, Chris. I love everything you're saying about Goodwill and how to make sense of it, because it can, there's so many examples of Goodwill in terms of businesses we see, like Goodwill, I think of it as a donation center. Goodwill is an accounting term. When I think of Goodwill, I think of it simply put as, would a colleague or will a colleague be willing to do something for me based on the goodness or the relationship we've built? Really kind of getting back to the nature of, this isn't a matter of keeping score, but it's a matter of going above and beyond maybe a job description or a job duty in the spirit of us or we, the team, not just I.
I love that.
How does that land with you?
That lands very well with me. It's something that ties back to, I think I can't pronounce the name, but it's like Cialdini, and he wrote the principles of good human relationships, essentially. One of them is the principle of reciprocity. So if you demonstrate goodwill to someone, they are more likely to demonstrate goodwill back to you. And the more we have that, the better culture we can create in our organizations.
Absolutely. I don't know who that is. I'm gonna have to look him up, but this idea of reciprocity is so powerful, especially in this day and age of hybrid work, which I think I saw a study from Korn Ferry recently. I believe hybrid work is the leading work arrangement currently. And as somebody who's very passionate about the future of work, I know many clients, friends, colleagues who are in office some 5 days a week, some 4-1, some 3-2, some fully remote. It's so important that we are building goodwill through this law of reciprocity. And that's harder to do when we're remote. It's like we're not always catching each other online at the same time. But I think two of the most powerful words, and this is really simple communication, that a team member or team members can use in order to feel that law of reciprocity is, Chris, I see you. Chris, I got you. So in other words, like if you Slack me a message or Teams me a message, we have all these connectivity tools, but sometimes we're lacking the actual human connection piece. If you ask me to do something, I'll pick it up later. Like, I see you, brother, and I got you. Like, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And I think this will become even more necessary in the future of work, where you're in Washington, D.C., I'm in Toronto. Of course, we're on Eastern time zone. But if we did have colleagues, or if we did have clients across the world that we may not be online at the same time, it's important that we see these messages and say, don't worry, one more bit about it, I got you. And that's the most reassuring thing that I would want to hear as a colleague, or from somebody who is supporting me. That's what builds goodwill.
That's very powerful. And it resonates so much with me because I have not heard those words in my previous workplaces. I would have loved to, though. If someone said, hey, I got you. You don't have to worry about that project that's due tomorrow. I can take it. I would be like, wow, this is a place I want to be. I think if we hear a lot more of that, it'll cultivate much better environments.
I agree. Chris, before we move on, I think listeners or viewers might want to hear, what have you heard? What's the opposite of I got you? Maybe things that weren't so supportive or encouraging.
The phrase that haunts me to this day in a previous workplace was, Chris, I need this done faster. I explained, this is why it can't be done faster. This is the support that I need to make sure that I can get it done maybe a little quicker, but I can't get it to the speed that you're requesting. And they said, I need it done faster. And that for me, it broke something in me. I said, it's not me that matters here. It's the work that needs to get done. And of course, you're in this organization to do good work, but that delivery of that sentiment could have been a little more effective, I feel.
I feel the same. Before I ask you what it would be, we problem solve here. I want to offer up a similar phrase that maybe viewers have heard, and it wasn't always uttered to me. Usually it was a manager or boss hiding behind a digital screen, but I need this by EOD. How many people in the chat, EOD or EOW, know what that means? I need this end of day. I need this end of week. If that gives you like a trigger response, then please drop a message in the chat, because I'd love to know, or we'd love to know what your version of this is. So Chris, when you were told, I need you to work faster, you kind of mentioned like you were quick to provide a rebuttal, or maybe it's even like self-advocacy is probably a better way to put that, of here's why that is impossible. What's a really simple way, if we were to bottom line for viewers, a way for you to stand up for yourself in a way that is confident and kind, is how I'm going to position it, given my practice.
Yeah. I particularly like your thesis, which is that we can be both confident and kind, because for communication to leadership or leadership communication to employees, I think we can have both. There's this stereotypical model of masculinity, let's say, that needs to be just confident or assertive or authoritative. And then the stereotypical model of femininity, which is compassion, empathy, kindness. But it's when we bridge them together that we can be great leaders. That's what I firmly believe in, and that's your mission. I think for an appropriate response that I could give would be to acknowledge why the leader wants it to be done faster. So there's me trying to understand it from their perspective. I say, yeah, I know your boss is asking you to get this done by the end of the week. I know where you're coming from. Let me also explain with my confidence from my area of expertise, from the technical domain I know very well, what will stop me from doing that? And maybe we can discuss together what are some ways we can overcome those obstacles, overcome those hurdles, and let me get to the goal that you want.
Wow. I'm really blown away, Chris, because it's so easy for us to want to like jump into like our armored mode, right? And like put on that Teflon shield and be like, here's why that's impossible. Or like, sorry, buddy, that ain't gonna happen. You know what I mean? But really what I'm hearing you say is that acknowledgement piece is so, so important. Like, I acknowledge this is important to you, or I acknowledge that this is urgent to senior leadership, or this is urgent for the organization, or urgent for the client. And I'm unsure if this is a realistic deadline for us to meet. Here's why, right? And I'm not optimistic that I can meet that deadline. I'm just one person. I'm not a robot. I would need these resources in order to make that possible. So I love that acknowledgement. That says so much about your character, Chris, and like who you are as leading from a place of empathy. So thank you for sharing that. Example.
And I love your addition to that as well. I think this is a good segue to the second topic of our talk today, which is introversion versus extroversion. How can influence manifest differently in both cases. So for me, I identify as an introverted person. That's the kind of response I would perhaps be more inclined to give. But I believe, Milam, you identify more as an extroverted person. Can you tell me a little bit more about the different ways you might approach those kinds of situations?
Sure. Great question. And surprise, I'm an extrovert. I'm a proud extrovert. Not that I feel that label's been put on me. It's actually something I appreciate about myself. And I think introversion and extroversion can be confused. And I don't think you have to be one or the other. Let me just be very clear for any viewers. It's certainly not a black or white situation, black and white situation. However, extroversion to me means when I'm having a conversation, an active conversation, I feel more charged by it. Mm-hmm. In other words, I have a better sense of where we stand. I feel like I can read my audience, like we talked about earlier, and really provide self-advocacy if that's needed. But really also just make sure, I'm going to use a metaphor of like playing tennis, that we're hitting the tennis ball across the net. My intention isn't to annihilate my opponent or have that ace. It's a matter of like actually hitting the ball to understand, okay, I'm getting more information, more assumptions. We're moving to a place of clarity as opposed to previously, like I understood what you wanted and I felt like you didn't at all understand or seek to understand what I want, which can be really, really jarring or triggering for people. So in terms of influence and goodwill, when it comes to extroversion, I find that leading with curiosity is so important for extroverts because it's so, it could be easy for extroverts to think like they're lazy or they don't want to engage. In other words, if they don't want to have a conversation, then they don't want to do the work. They're avoidant. They're backing away. They're passing the buck. They want somebody else to do the work. Those are all preconceived notions, and that's storytelling that may not really actually be accurate or indicative of the lived experience from a colleague or a counterpart, even a client. So I see this all the time in my practice when I'm working with leaders, many of which who are sales leaders and very senior in their organizations. And they're really eager like me, really enthusiastic, and they're waiting for an external response from a prospect or pending client. And they get real antsy and they don't like playing the waiting game. And they start maybe communicating in a way that seems really aggressive or really desperate. I tell them like, whoa, take a deep breath, hit the brakes, slow down. Think about what you'd want to hear if you were in their shoes. So a great example of this is I just earlier this morning and yesterday had calls with clients who their clients were impacted by the Microsoft power outage. That it was a big deal in the news, at least for airlines. A lot of the airlines went down. And so this client was wondering why they hadn't heard from their prospect and said, I don't know if their dog got sick baby at home, which I can relate to as a new dad. And come to find out the client had been impacted by the Microsoft power outage, shortage, what have you, whatever it was. I'm not clear on the technical details, but it was a great lesson for my client in that we never really know what's going on. So lead with curiosity in order to better understand the person with which it is you're communicating with.
That's a very interesting analogy for me. You had the analogy of, as an extroverted person, that when you're in conversation with someone, it's kind of like a tennis match, the ball volleying back and forth. For me, it's different as an introverted person. I much rather prefer the spotlight be put on you when we're talking. So I don't have to engage constantly in continuous interaction, but I ask you the questions. I make you the star of the show. That's easier for me. So doing what I'm doing now when we're engaging in this volleying is more difficult, but an exciting challenge. What I advise for introverts to do is to lead with confidence. So you said for extroverts, they can lead with curiosity, maybe pull back a little bit, learn a little bit more about the other person's perspective. For introverts, you have great ideas. Go out there and let your voice be heard with them. And you can still put the spotlight on the other person. You don't have to take up and be the star of the show yourself, but you can balance those things.
Chris, brilliant. Let me play that back for all of our viewers. As an extrovert, I said lead with curiosity. Chris, as an introvert, said lead with confidence. The analogy that's now coming up for me, based on what you shared, is it's a basketball analogy, you know, I'm a big sports guy. You would rather be the point guard that lobs up the ball and have the extrovert, you know, the alley-oop slam dunk it. So I'm going to use Kobe Shaq, RIP. It's like the introvert's like Kobe, lob the ball. Shaq, he wants the spotlight. Shaq's the extrovert. He wants to slam dunk it. So for any sports viewers out there, I hope you understand that. And if not, make it your own. But that's a brilliant, brilliant share of encouraging introverts to share their ideas. Because like you said, they have wonderful ideas. It's just a matter of being confident when sharing it.
Exactly. I think this is a perfect segue to the last topic, which is how do we share these great ideas, or how do we respond when people are communicating with us as introverts and extroverts in an effective way?
Yeah.
So the last topic will be some practical tips everyone here can take away with respect to that.
Love that. Love that. Love that. Where do we want to jump off here? I'm thinking of like a basketball court now jumping.
Yeah. Let's see. We can talk about some situations that we've encountered at work and how they might be tackled differently with respect to communication. Okay. So let's say someone comes to you and says, hey, Milam, you always do this, or you never do this. What would you prefer to hear instead of that?
Well, I'd prefer to hear you always do this really well, but I don't think that's what they're coming to say. If somebody came with really absolute language of like, you never close the loop, or you never respond to that email fast enough. That's probably something I encountered when I was corporate. I was a bit more of like a slow, measured, methodical worker. Like, you're not moving fast enough. I think what I would want to hear, to simplify that communication tip, what I would want to receive is, Milam, I'm noticing you move slower than others. And that's fine. They can compare me to others, or Milam, I noticed that you seem to be moving slower than a past version of yourself. Like I noticed with this client, for example, you're slower with this client than that client. It would really help me play data scientist on myself in order to raise my own self-awareness of, oh, they have a point, they're right. And really operate from that place of curiosity. Like, when did you start noticing this? Or, interesting. What advice would you give me, or tips do you have? Or maybe it would open up an even more vulnerable conversation of, you're right, I'm really scared of that client's response. Or I'm really intimidated to reach out to that sales prospect, for example. So to have a colleague, boss, or anyone come and say you never or you should, those are really, let's just say, sensitive language. So I would encourage listeners, shoulda, coulda, woulda, anytime you hear shoulds, be very, very mindful with that communication style, because it could be well-intentioned, what you're trying to deliver, but it may not always be received well.
I really like that. And something I'd add is, if we're very specific with our feedback as well, we don't say you always do this or you never do this, which becomes interpreted as a character flaw.
That's right.
You can instead say, in this situation, I would have preferred you respond a little more quickly because due to the delay, we had this negative consequence. So in the future, let's talk about how we can make sure that you have more prompt communication, especially for this kind of client. That way it's less something I take personally, and it's more something, okay, this is a small behavior I can change.
That's right. Brilliant. I thank you for tying that to an employee's output versus their character, which are two uniquely different things. Yes. And character is something we don't want to assassinate in the workplace. We really want to try to give people the benefit of the doubt and create a spirit of inclusivity. And what I always say in my practice, BCK, is optimism. Like, believe that people have the power to change, and that if we train them and upskill them, then they can be the best version of themselves as employees. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. I want to provide a different example, Chris, and see how you would respond. So I'm going to kind of tailor this to the clients you serve, many of which who are like technical heavy, in the weeds with the data. And say somebody came to them and said, you're wrong, like this report's wrong, or you presented this information wrong, like wrong. And they get really defensive, and they say, and then the person tells them, calm down.
Yeah.
What would they want to hear instead of calm down? What's a simpler, better way to put that? Calm down seems simple in principle. It's 2 words, but actually can do the opposite effect of calming down. It could actually enrage them or enliven them. What would be a better way of framing that?
I've heard that the worst thing to say to someone who's upset is calm down, because then they will do the exact opposite of that. What I like to tell technical professionals is to ask more questions. I saw a situation similar to what you described. There was some person I was working with, they were explaining something. Someone else said, you don't understand. They started to argue, and nobody was really meeting anywhere in the middle. And instead of asking each other questions to genuinely understand, what do you think? What do I think? They were just going off in those different directions. So what I would recommend is, instead of telling people what to do, we can ask them more about their perspective. If we understand more what they feel, maybe we can understand it better ourselves. We can develop that empathy. And by doing so, be able to handle the situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm hearing you say is focus on what they're feeling. What are you experiencing, or how do you feel? And something that's been really effective in my own life and with those that I serve in my practice is encouraging. If you're a people manager, which is who I serve, encourage a walk and talk. Say, you want to go outside and walk this off? Because sometimes it's easier to walk side by side and not look somebody in the eyes when it's really heated and or a really sensitive topic, delivering feedback. And also it's important for leaders to own up when we feel like we've missed the mark. Like, my bad. In the office, I came off really strong. I really want to own that. Like, let's get some fresh air, walk it out. What were you feeling in that moment? When I said this, how did it make you feel? What were you experiencing? And oftentimes just taking a walk, getting fresh air, it can really bring down the temperature that often rises in corporate settings or in the room.
I love that. I see we're almost at time, so I want to briefly wrap things up and tell people how they can learn more about what we do. We talked about a lot of great stuff today. The first was, what is influence and what is goodwill? We made some conclusions that influence is how we inspire people within our organizations. Instead of just giving all this information, we tell people what they should do about it, how they should feel about it. Goodwill being, we do more than what's perhaps formally expected of us to encourage the principle of reciprocity. So if we do good for someone, they'll do good for us. We then talked about introversion and extroversion and how that influence manifests a little differently. For introverts, perhaps the spotlight is not something we like to embrace, but we can lead with more confidence to let our voice be heard. And for extroverts, we can lead with perhaps more curiosity, ask more questions, understand that other point of view. And that facet of understanding the other point of view is how we can engage in better communication in the workplace. If we encounter situations where someone says, calm down, or someone says, you don't understand, or someone says, you always or you never, it really helps to understand, where is that other person coming from? And by understanding that, we can tackle the situation better. Is there anything you'd want to add to that brief summary?
Chris, I'm blown away. Like, that was a really good recap. You summarized 30 minutes down into maybe 30 seconds. I'm no scorekeeper, so that was brilliant. But I love this idea of, we hope this has served and helped many people out there that are viewing this live. This is my first LinkedIn Live, so I'm wearing a beginner's mindset cap and just enjoying this. And Chris, I want to thank you for setting it up and holding such wonderful space. So why don't we share how people can find us? Yeah. In my case, Be Confident and Kind. We live on the World Wide Web. If you visit our website, we have a contact us page. And if you scroll to the very bottom, we have some resources about workshops that are intended to help rising leaders and serve them in the workplace. So we have topics that include influence, motivation, executive presence. So please check that out on beconfidentandkind.com. Chris, where can everyone find you?
I also am on the World Wide Web at thehiddenspeaker.com. You can also follow me here on LinkedIn. And what I focus on are trainings and workshops centered around how can we as technical and data folks communicate more effectively in the workplace. It starts with, how can we talk to stakeholders better? How can we understand their point of view? How can we push back against unreasonable requests in a kind and confident way, let's say? How can we make sure that with all this data and all these numbers that we have access to, how do we arrange them in a way, into a presentation, into a story that actually moves people to action?
Beautiful. Thanks for using my words, Chris.
I love your combination of those.
Yeah. And you articulated it so well earlier about the masculine and feminine energy and balance that so well, because we all bring oneself to work, and we hope that you leave this LinkedIn Live event feeling as if though you can increase your influence and build more goodwill with your colleagues. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.